Hi, my name is Geeta Gandbhir, and I'm a filmmaker, and you're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing.
Yeah. My name is Abhay, and I share conversations with talented and interesting individuals linked to the global Indian and South Asian community. It's informal and informative, adding insights to our evolving cultural expressions, where each person can proudly say, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. I can guarantee that there will be virtually no Marathi spoken during this episode, but it's really, really just wonderful to connect with Geeta Gandbhir. Geeta, thank you so much for joining us today.
And thank you for having me. And I actually do speak Marathi, so we could speak Marathi, not a problem.
जमलं तर आपण बोलूया.
बोलूया, काय हरकत नाही.
Both our, like I said, both our eyes will be very proud, at least of that moment right there.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you this. I mean, in getting to learn a little bit more about you, what is probably a very playful, at least, marker for me that I noticed, but your Instagram profile photo features the Black Panther from the poster of Lowndes County and the Road to Black Power. Is that kind of a symbolic proxy for your general approach to the world?
I think so. I mean, so that honestly, that I just love that artwork
Yeah.
from the poster. I've worked on a number of films, and the artwork for each of them is special. But that one was, I think, one of the first ones I've had that was hand drawn in that way.
Oh, wow.
And to me, it was so reminiscent of the spirit of Lowndes County and what the folks were trying to do down there and their organizing. So it's always an inspiration to me to see it. Reminds me of them and how they paved the way for us who are here now.
Yeah.
That's why I keep it up.
Do you need sort of reminding of that, or has that been sort of infused now very well, not just in your professional work, but even just your personal life?
I think I was fortunate enough to come up with folks who are groundbreaking in the industry, like Spike Lee and Sam Pollard. So for me, it was my foundation. And then my mother, I have to say, my mother is kind of a rebellious person who broke a lot of boundaries and a lot of norms for women in the time period that she was here and in India as well. She definitely doesn't toe the line of the traditional line of
Right.
patriarchy and all the things
Yeah.
that she could
Good.
have, and was raised with. And that actually came from her father, who was also very progressive for his time. So I think for me, that spirit, I have to say, it's been with me since I was very young. Again, my mother, and then some of the folks that I've been lucky enough to be supported by and mentored by.
Well, I mean, and what that I think speaks to for a lot of folks is when you have that spirit in you of constantly both questioning and the spirit of activism, it does sort of build power and presence in all the work you do. So I'm curious, particularly for you, what you find perhaps most empowering when it comes to making documentary films, and especially in an age where decentralization and AI and so many things tend to actually be disrupting empowerment,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to making art.
Sure. So I think for me, documentary film has always been interesting. I started in fiction and in narrative, but
Yeah.
again, I started with Spike Lee, and I was in the independent film world in the '90s here with a lot of artists who were again doing films that push the envelope. So I worked with Spike Lee. I worked very briefly with the Coen brothers. I worked with on Hudsucker Proxy for I think a couple of weeks, and then I got shifted to something else. And I
Yeah.
worked with Merchant Ivory. But these are folks who, again, were doing film that was not traditional Hollywood. They were telling stories that were edgy, that may have had some sort of message to them, whether or not they were overt. And
Yeah.
so that for me really influenced the way that I see art. that artists are people who don't necessarily, who in my world, it might be the studio system, but it's oftentimes that there is the mainstream media that walks on one side of the street and artists walk on the other. And you
Mm,
know, again, or even if you do collaborate, your job as the artist is to, again, to push for change and to uplift voices that maybe have not been heard. So for me, that was a really important part of my upbringing. And I think right now we are facing obviously the threats of disinformation of again our world being it's the pathway to fascism, right? But
yeah.
to create sort of a dystopian reality, the death of facts, the again the disinformation, the polarization, all of that is part of the strategy to keep us apart. And I think what is so interesting with and I just want to say this, a free press is the cornerstone of any healthy democracy. And documentary film stems from journalism. It is sort of sometimes lives in the cross section of journalism and cinema and
Yeah.
cinematic art. So there are, again, some documentaries that are very news based, fact based, you know, again, that lean into sort of something that is pure journalism. And then there are others that lean more into cinema. Not
Yeah.
saying I think those still have to be fact checked, but they might be
Right.
more of an opinion piece.
Yeah.
I think living in this cross section is really interesting because you see attacks on both art and journalism.
Right.
And the government's sort of trying very hard right now with the current administration to tamp down anything that could be seen as dissent, anything that could, again, push back against the agenda that they're trying to press forward. What's interesting is in the same way that there are things that have taken over the documentary industry or have been at a threat of replacing the documentary industry, but at the same time, people are then using those platforms to create hybrid almost of documentary and whatever that platform might be, like TikTok, for example.
Mm,
People are
yeah.
using TikTok to tell whole stories, and that's really fascinating. So I
Well,
think we have to be flexible, but it's a really important time to push for documentary and for it to remain as viable as it's been.
I was just going to say, I mean, that speaks a lot to the kind of idea that that power is being redistributed in a way, and to some healthy effects, where we sort of keep at least our attention focused in as many places as possible, so that we're not losing sight of where marginalized struggles are happening. And yet the documentary substrate is one that is, like you said, has many important intersections there. Like for you, has that taken a lot of practice for you to find at least the sweet spot of saying that, like, yes, I have a very different vantage point on this than I did perhaps when I was first starting my career? I mean, the notion that, like, how you approach this today perhaps is a little bit different than how you approached this maybe early on in your career when you were first sort of making that transition and that jump from narrative scripts to documentary making.
It's interesting. It hasn't. It
It
hasn't.
hasn't.
I think
Okay.
it's still great about great storytelling. I think
Yeah.
that so documentary is not that different from narrative in the sense that what matters most, I have found, and
Mm,
again, every filmmaker has their thoughts on this, is the connection to the people in
yeah.
the story that you're telling. And a good documentary still needs to have all the elements that a scripted film would have as far as storytelling. Ideally, there's an arc that you follow. There's someone that you connect deeply to, that you say you feel that you can walk in their shoes. I think the difference between news and documentary is oftentimes, and particularly documentaries can be short or long, right?
Right.
But it is that connection to the participants, as we now call them, and their journey that
Right.
makes for people to feel that they are on a ride with you and that it is not just informational. Because I
Mm,
think what can happen with documentaries is that if they feel too dry, if they feel like it is purely information, then people don't attach, right? They
right.
don't feel concerned about the what's happening. They don't
Yeah.
care. But
Yeah.
you
There's
have
less compelling natures to them.
Yes, but documentary can be just as entertaining
Yeah.
as scripted. And I think that's really important. And also
And by the way, did you know that from the very outset, or is that something that's taken some patience and some practice for you to really come to that? You know,
I think because I began in scripted and was in scripted for 10 years,
yeah.
that was my foundation. That was
Mm,
my, and before that, I studied art and I studied animation and
right.
I worked in animation, and that's similarly storytelling. So I've had a trajectory that's a little bit different. I
Right.
didn't come from like a journalism background. I came from a film background and a cinema background. So my segue into documentary was really one. I started with the perspective of it being about storytelling and the art of cinema and how you tell a great story. And
Mm,
so I don't have the foundation a lot of folks have who came from news and journalism.
right.
So for me, it was always art. The art kind of was the basis, and I
Sure.
had to learn the other pieces of it, which were how it's different with documentary when you're dealing with real people, obviously real stories, and the journalistic norms were something I had to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, speaking of Spike Lee, I was reading a little bit where certainly you have some upcoming work with Spike Lee and Samantha Knowles, and he once said that you have this incredible empathy for struggling people, and that it shows in your films, and that you're a filmmaker who never exploits her protagonist's misery.
Spike Lee said that?
Yeah,
I've never seen that in my life.
So I'm curious, for that, and at least reflecting on that, is that empathy at the core of providing both kind of the foundational anchors and even the uplifting buoys for an audience to feel that same kind of connection to a story?
I do think empathy is incredibly important
Yeah,
in storytelling in general. We have to be able to, and this goes across the board to me: narrative, writing, script, right, unscripted, documentary, etc. But in even in any kind of storytelling, if you don't feel that you can walk in the shoes of the protagonist or the characters, if it's a fictional book, the participants, if it's a true story, if you can't walk in their shoes in some way, I think that is what leads to it being uninteresting to you.
yeah,
So for me, that I think as a director, I think or a filmmaker, and for folks who are in every department, it's incredibly important to be able to immerse yourself in the world of the characters or the participants and understand what they would feel, and
yeah,
then be able to translate that to a greater audience. That's, I think, a key part of the process. And yeah, empathy, I do think, is necessary. I mean, I think
yeah,
you can also very dispassionately tell a story about someone or something
yeah.
that you don't care about, but no matter what, you have a POV. The filmmaker has a POV. It's impossible not to. So, are really
And do you
integral.
sometimes, I mean, toggle between having to have, some agnostic perspective on things, even though it is remaining your POV, and
Absolutely.
yet, and then does it also take a fair amount of patience to remind stakeholders to actually like, really, this is the mission of this project, or this is the vantage point,
Absolutely.
you know?
Absolutely. I think sometimes as filmmakers, we deal with myself and other folks that I know have worked on projects where you might be dealing with something where, again, the participants or the characters, if it's a narrative, don't always elicit immediate empathy,
Yeah,
so that they've created a situation for themselves that puts them in the seat of being the villain, or
mm,
they have committed a crime.
yeah,
Oftentimes, immediately, it's very hard to relate. But I think our job as a filmmaker is to contextualize
yeah,
to contextualize what they've done, or not, or not.
right.
Sometimes there is no contextualizing it in a way that makes it understandable. But our job is to give as much of a 360 as we can.
Right.
In journalism, there's that saying that one side someone will tell you it's raining, someone else will tell you it's not raining, and our job is to go outside and figure out if it's raining,
Yeah.
and that's to find
And
that.
show it on film and in story, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, how did you, our connection here is because of a mutual family friend, and the question, that I have is, how did you become so poised to particularly highlight the Black American experience, especially as an Indian American woman whose parents came here in the 60s and 70s with a very, very different backdrop of experiences, and your own lived experiences than sometimes, at least on the surface, is what's perceived from the Black American experience. How did that intersection at least come about so wonderfully for you?
So I think I really think it's been a privilege and to be allowed into the the worlds I have been and the
Yeah,
communities that have allowed me in. The coming up here was a very different experience than I think our parents had in India, again, where they were living in a place where they were, to a certain degree, the majority. My experiences here as a young person, they're definitely coming up in the 70s. There was definitely racism. My parents didn't necessarily understand it or know what it was, but I was in settings that were predominantly white at times and experienced racism that I think made me understand, again, very different degree,
yeah,
obviously, but that drew me to other communities of color and to identify with other communities of color because of this common experience of racism. And again, I in no way, I mean, obviously Asian Americans have their own story here.
sure,
And I walk through the world as a South Asian woman, so I do not have the lived experience at all of
right,
the anyone in the African American community. But and then after that, I was really interested in film. I was really interested in perspectives that were not the majority for that were not sort of a white centered or Eurocentric lens of the world.
yeah,
And so for me, that led to interest in filmmakers like Mira Nair. I think I saw her work very early, Salam Bombay. Also, I grew up watching Bollywood because my
yeah,
parents watched Bollywood films. And to me, that was really, and I loved animated films and I loved Star Wars because Star Wars was about a rebellion and, so those kind
yeah,
of films were influential. And then independent filmmakers like Mira and Spike Lee. I remember I saw Do the Right Thing in the theater
yeah,
and it blew my mind. And then my education too. I think I was interested in what at the time was called cross-cultural anthropology, which I don't know what it would be called now, but it basically meant the study of people of color, which is
yeah,
so like that term is so rude now and so
right,
inappropriate. But I studied. I was interested in the study of other of communities and also the intersection where of movements between communities that had either, again, the African American community was brought here unwillingly. They were essentially trafficked, right? Stolen and trafficked. Our community are immigrants, but it's, there's, again, people leave home only because they have to.
mm,
So there's the question, and that's true for many immigrants across. If you're looking for something better, it means what you have at home is not working for you, or that there is not enough resources, or something is wrong. So I think for me, then after college, I met Spike Lee, and he hired me on Malcolm X. I basically followed him around. He was teaching at Harvard, and I was working for an
yeah,
animation professor there, Susan Pitt, who was an incredible artist. And I bumped into Spike and then followed him around the campus until he hired me because I was 21 and I didn't want to live in my parents' basement any longer.
right. There you
I
go.
just graduated and my life was not what I wanted it to be. And then he hired me on Malcolm X, and really he single-handedly changed my life. Like
Yeah,
that one opportunity he gave me was the one I was able to run with. And I met him. Obviously, I met Sam Pollard. And Spike Lee's 40 Acres was a jumping ground, like a jump. Like it was essentially an incubator for so much
yeah,
talent. And Spike it wasn't just me. Spike made it an incubator for BIPOC folks, people of color. So
Right.
I met folks there there was another Indian woman there, Tula Goenka, who really became a close friend and mentor. She now teaches at Syracuse. She's a professor. She took
Hmm.
me under her wing. I also met another woman who profoundly influenced me, Sonia Gonzalez Martinez. She's an editor, but she was like kind of treated me like a younger sister,
Yeah.
even though I think we're about the same age. But she was, and she's Puerto Rican. So it was sort of, again, a very diverse place
Yeah.
where a lot of us could get a start. And I can't tell you how many people have come out of there. Like that
Oh
was,
yeah.
a training ground, and then they've sort of spread, grown wings and taken off.
And you mentioned that there's a gratitude of being allowed into these spaces, and there's a lot of community there, and mentors and peers, and you develop this great, a lot of substrate for learning and developing then your point of view, and the deep empathy that's involved in not just the events or the storytelling, but the history behind it, and so much depth to that. What maybe did you actually have to unlearn about yourself in order for you to then embrace being welcomed into that space, or embrace the opportunity of now spending time in that space and storytelling with the perspective of great mentors like Spike Lee and others? And were there things about your own upbringing or experience that you had to sort of unspool in order to
Sure.
sort of embrace that?
Absolutely. I think we are all tainted by
Yeah.
living in a culture that otherizes us in some ways. Again, I have incredible opportunity, obviously, has been afforded to myself, my family here in the
Yeah.
US, but there's also biases that we inherit. And I think within our own culture and on our family, there's a lot of anti-blackness,
Yeah.
which it comes from, again, living in a white supremacist, patriarchal, uh, heteronormative,
Colonial.
right, colonial
Yeah.
society. And
Yeah.
I think for me, the the idea that, and as you know, I think there's so much within our communities. What worries me is that or that obviously was a concern and something that I struggle with a lot, is this sort of goal of white adjacency within the Indian, or the South Asian community, I should say. And I think
Yeah.
that I mean, you see it now. You see now, like who are some of the folks aligning themselves with and also working under the Trump
Yeah.
administration. So I'm just going to
Right.
say it plainly. Like, who are folks who, again, are looking to support deportation and the hideous treatment of other sort of vulnerable groups of
Yeah.
immigrant groups here?
Yeah.
Who, like, how could that be? But it's this, again, this desire, and it's also Hindu sort of fundamentalist thing to try to align ourselves, right? But based, I think, historically in the caste system, to try to align yourself with sort of the person who is the highest in the racial hierarchy here.
Mm.
And I think for me, that was a really important and painful lesson to shed that, and I
Yeah.
don't know, I don't, we all think we don't have it, but in some way, some of the things I think about that I was in pursuit of, you know, as a young person coming up here, the things that I valued were based in that system,
Sure.
sort of a
Yeah.
racist system that valued certain achievements and saw others as less than. And so those are things that I had to contend with and shed. I also really it was really important to me to think about forging alliances. How
Mm.
do we align ourselves? How do I become an ally? How do
Yeah.
I, again,
And that builds power, by the way.
yeah, how do I not bring with me all this baggage, this colonial baggage? And become, how do I work in support of the communities that I am telling stories about? And
Yeah.
I think for me too, and particularly in the more recent years, there's been in the documentary community, I think the documentary community is one of the first to really like sparked this flame, but the representation has
Mm.
been incredibly important to me and to a lot of my colleagues,
Yeah.
and behind the camera as well as in front of it, because documentary is one, and film in general is 100% a colonial exercise, but documentary filmmaking in particular has always been about, as we know it, particularly in Western culture, has been about folks usually of European descent going into communities that are not of European descent,
Right.
and bringing with them that very imbalanced power dynamic, and telling their stories
Yeah.
with no real say from them, with no agency from them. So there is a whole movement in the documentary industry to decolonize documentary and to make
Mm.
that different, and now we don't say subjects anymore. We say participants,
Yeah.
because we want the people whose stories we are telling, to have as much agency in the telling of their stories as we do, and to be uplifted, and again, to debunk the sort of racist colonial structure of documentary. But this exists in filmmaking too. When you look at filmmaking, it's always been a
Sure.
fight: who tells our stories?
Right.
And it's critical that it's us. It's
Well,
critical that
and
there's representation.
those structures are so rampant in so many different arena of society. I mean, art and institutions. When I think of pieces that you have to let go of and really shed to be able to make and liberate yourself to create a project to realize some art, what specifically did you maybe have to shed or let go of, particularly with this project of The Perfect Neighbor?
So The Perfect Neighbor is actually, oddly, it's a personal film, because Ajika Owens, who's the young mother in the film,
Yeah.
it was my sister-in-law's best friend. So that
Mm.
is so I think it's a different project than the others that I've
Yeah.
done, because of that deeply personal connection to my family and to people I love. And we really became involved in the beginning because we wanted to advocate for the family. The perpetrator was not arrested. Stand your ground laws came into play, and
Yeah.
we hit the ground very quickly. Particularly my partner, who's also a producer on the film, Nakan Kwantu, he hit the ground pretty quickly with my sister-in-law. I have two sister-in-laws who
Yeah.
were on the ground immediately, and one, the best friend, the other is a incredible activist and organizer. And so she basically, the minute it happened, she got the phone call, she called us,
Right.
my husband went down, and we were there trying to use whatever skills we had, really with the media, trying
Yeah.
to help organize, just to make sure that there was some sort of justice. And then about a couple months, so we were started work Ben Crump's team came on board. We were working with them to help in the figure out media that could keep the case alive and
Mm.
tell, stories. Because even after the arrest of Susan Lawrence, who's the perpetrator, we did not know if she would be convicted.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, we have seen what happened with Trayvon Martin. We have
Yeah.
seen stand your ground used in a number of ways, and so as defense, when it's really shouldn't. Obviously, it's a law that's very dangerous for people of color. It's
Yeah.
often abused. So about 2 months in, we got our hands on all this body cam footage that had been the prosecution, one of the attorneys had done a FOIA request or sued the police department. The Freedom of Information Act used that to get the footage from the police department of any body camera footage that existed, plus all the things that had
Hmm.
been created in the investigation. And
Yeah.
that's when we got our hands on 2 years worth of body cam footage. And
Right.
that's when I was like, oh, there's a story here that we should
Yeah.
tell. And working hand in hand with Ajika's mother, we made this film. It was really to showcase the dangers of stand your ground, but also we wanted to subvert the police body camera footage, which is so often used to surveil vulnerable communities of
Yeah.
color, and again, it's used as a tool to persecute them and to prosecute them. We wanted to flip that on its head, the use of the footage. And they also wanted to showcase this beautiful community as they
Hmm.
were prior to the
Yeah.
murder. Because you never see that. You often just see with something like terrible like this, it's the day of,
Right.
if anything. But you see this incredible community sort of living together, supporting each other, raising their kids together. And Susan was this one outlier, and her access to a gun is
Mm.
what sort of, again, had this terrible ripple effect on the whole community.
And this was something that was so deeply personal and wove in a lot of your innate activism and this notion of there's more to it than the sort of like news cycle aspect of this, that you only see that one first slice, and there's so much work that still needs to be done. Is this an instance where the line between filmmaker and director and participant was a little bit more blurry than usual?
I think I was not in the film, and I purposely didn't put any myself. My family is in the film,
Yeah.
but organically, just because they were there. You see
Right.
them in some of the footage, but particularly in the aftermath, they were there in some of the news footage and the court. The footage that takes place in the court.
Yeah.
I think that absolutely it was a very hard film to make
Yeah.
because I don't know if I was 100% objective, but it took all of my ability and an incredible team that I had
Sure.
to really to work on it with me and also I wanted them, it was important for them to hold me accountable and to us
Mm.
accountable to making the best film possible, as opposed to trying to have our feelings
Sure.
override the process. And
Yeah.
so um it was hard. Somebody said to me later, they said, "Oh, after it screened at Sundance, they saw the film and heard why we made it." And they said, "Oh, it was grief work." And I was like,
Mm.
"Oh, that's a really great term. I've never heard that
Yeah.
term." But, I think it was something
Sure.
that we needed to do because, one, I don't have any other skills. I have nothing else to offer this. so,
I
so that's
mean,
all there is.
right. It's your vehicle. Sure.
That's the only thing I could do for them. But
Yeah.
also, yeah, I just couldn't. I wanted to understand, how do we go from someone being your neighbor and you're
Yeah.
annoyed with them over a dispute about noise that children make who play near your house, to an actual murder? Like,
Yeah. The loss of life.
how does that happen? Like
Yeah.
that, to me, it's something that I feel like, again, and in these fraught times we live in, it feels like it's something that it really it felt like a cautionary tale.
Mm. With that, it's certainly fodder for a lot of important policy and activism work
Yes.
that still needs to be done. Does this a film like that, and such a difficult and personal one to make, does it change the arc of what you hope mentoring and legacy are all about for you when it comes to your the sort of professional journey that you're on?
So, does it change mentoring and legacy as far as this film goes? I don't think so, because I feel like part of my journey, and this is inspired by Sam Pollard and Spike Lee, has always been to try to raise up other filmmakers. Like Sam did that for me, Spike did that for me. And the more of us there are, particularly filmmakers whose voices are historically marginalized, that is where my goal lies, is to open the door for as many of us as possible, because
I guess does it make you see your mentees, or message to your mentees and those around you that personal items and really really deeply enmeshed stories like this are in fact really valuable and should have a place.
Yeah, I don't think it changes that, because I already knew
Mm,
and
yeah.
that's something. Again, this one happens to be mine, or a
Yeah.
story that is, and I never thought I would knew if I would tell a story or have a story that I was personally connected to like this be one that I make, because I love all
Yeah.
of everything I work on. They're all my heart, but This one it just happens to be that there's this
Mm.
connection. But I think for me, I've worked on other films before. I've had the honor of working on other films before. I worked on a film called The Sentence years ago with a dear friend of mine, Rudy Valdez, and it was his personal journey. And it was really about his sister who was incarcerated for 9 years. It's on HBO. And so, but that story to me was one that I worked on again, his journey, but because
Right.
he's my friend and I love him, it was, it became mine too. And
Yeah.
that film too, it was that much more powerful because of the personal connection. So I think I've known this. And there's beautiful films like Strong Island that won the Academy Award. Yancey Ford is a colleague and someone I admire very deeply. And that was his film about his brother, the murder
Yeah.
of his brother. And that was incredibly powerful. So I had seen them before, like I said, but it's interesting. The choice with The Perfect Neighbor was
Mm.
really not to have my connection to it or
Yeah.
my family's connection to it inherent in the film. We
Right.
wanted it to sort of play on its own.
And it sounds like that organic spirit is one that's so pervasive for you that, it's sort of always going to be there for your mentoring and for legacy for that matter.
Yeah,
Um,
and the mentoring, like I said, I obviously I try as much as possible to support filmmakers, and but it is a challenging time for us.
yeah.
There's, with funding being cut, there's obviously the government defunding PBS, NPR, NEA grants, NEH grants, like it's really, it feels like there is a direct war right now against what we do. And
Yeah.
so it's a time where we really all need to, I think, figure out ways to continue to do this work.
How do you find levers of capital and power and allyship as a person of color, as a South Asian woman, as an Indian American, as a non-white filmmaker who's representing and advocating and activating in 2025 then with the backdrop you just mentioned?
So there's a lot of organizations that have been building power and throughout for many, many years. So I think it's this collective organizing that is most critical and that we have to keep doing. And I just want to say for people of color in this industry and in so many industries, this is nothing new. I mean,
Mm,
there is an indirect offensive right now, but at the same time, as folks who've been historically shut out and independent filmmakers, this has always been the
this is
way.
not a new story.
It's like jazz musicians, or it's
Yeah.
like the
Yeah.
artists that don't walk, you know, sort of
Sure.
you don't do the mainstream and sort of look for tell stories that are considered alternative, even though they are
Mm,
not. This is what has always been the case. So it's still disheartening and it shouldn't be this way, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not new. So I
yeah.
think there's organizations like there's the Black Documentary Collective, there's Brown Girls Doc Mafia, there's ADOC, which is the Asian Documentary Association,
Hmm.
if I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
But there's a bunch of organizations that exist. There's the Queer Producers Collective, so that have again been working to figure out ways. There's also a great organization, Chicken and Egg, that has supported my work and continues to support the work of female filmmakers, of women,
Yeah.
people, forgive me, it should be of filmmakers who identify as female.
Sure.
Um, they support, they give grants. So there's a lot of places that have been fighting hard and doing the work. What concerns me right now is that they're also at risk.
Mm,
So
yeah.
I'm hoping, that we have to sort of lean on folks who might have the resources to really step up in some ways, to donate to these orgs, to keep them going, to sort of, again, to continue the push.
We'll pivot to a different kind of push here. I'm going to do some quick rapid fire for you. Just play with this a little bit. What's your favorite Amar Chitrakarta title?
Oh, probably the Mahabharat series that they
Hmm.
did. It's the whole
Yeah.
series. I've read that series, I think front to back. And the
Right.
Mahabharata is always just one of my favorite.
Yeah.
long longitudinal stories. So,
Is there a favorite character that you sort of, like their story arc?
so of course, Draupadi, but who was the, again, the only, aside from the, the mother. But I also really liked Arjuna.
Mm,
Arjuna was really interesting because he was the
yeah.
archer. So
Yeah.
I liked his character a lot.
What's the most underrated Star Wars character?
Oh my God. The most underrated Star Wars character.
And maybe someone who endears and endures, but not necessarily the first in line when it comes to getting love as a Star Wars character.
That's so funny. What's his name? So there's a couple that I think of, but I'm forgetting the name right now. The general who's with the Rebel Command, but he's of
Oh,
that the fish faced one.
yeah.
What's his name? I love him.
Just
He's the one who says it's a trap.
it's a trap, right?
That is my favorite. He's one of my favorites. I also love the Jawas. The Jawas, I
There
think
you
that
go.
there's something slightly racially problematic. Like there's like with the Jawas and the Sand People, but like it's just that, but I think just the Jawas as sort of a community has always been
Mm,
really interesting to me.
yeah.
I think though, so certainly Rogue One was my favorite
Wow.
of the films, and then
Yeah.
I was just watching Andor as of recent
All right.
with my kids. So I watched Andor throughout like the entirety of it, and
Right.
a colleague and sort of someone, Bo Willimon, was a writer on it, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm blown away by how radical it was, and
Yeah.
like meaning it wasn't that radical, but that it was that they allowed something like that to air. That was really like a win for Disney and for
Yeah.
yeah.
Big changes from mid 70s filmmaking to
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
2025,
yeah.
right?
But and
Yeah.
I love the original, the whole
Yeah.
Star Wars series. But I think like Rogue One to me, just the kind of the messaging of it, also the execution of it, I
Mm.
thought was great.
All right. Last quick one. What's the best decade of hip hop?
Oh wow.
I know
That's
my answer at least, but
that's really hard. Because there's the really early stuff from the late 70s and the early
yeah. Yep.
80s. I mean, to me, because it's the birth of it, I think that's I mean, that to me is sort of the most amazing
Yeah.
one. But then I think some of the best, some of the artists that have come out since then, even more recently, have been so incredible
Yeah.
and so creative that I almost feel like that really early time period, and then even the more recent,
Mm-hmm.
really creative stuff
Yeah. They feel
uh,
very similar.
is interesting, where
Yeah.
there's sort of a renaissance.
Yeah. Kind of late 70s, mid 80s, or early 80s stuff, and even the stuff that's coming out now that's very, very grassroots. For me,
Yeah.
still, it's mid 90s, early 90s.
The early 90s is really great too. The early 90s was really great. But I feel like there's people now who have taken from that and taken it
Yeah.
further, you
As
know.
many will say, right? It's all new and it's all the same.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. That's right. But then it's true that our 90s was very creative.
Let me get you out of here on this one. I mean, at the end of the day, and especially for those who might be discovering your work for the very first time, how do you, through your films, cultivate trust?
That's a really good question. And that's really important. I think the trust of your team is really important, and the trust of the participants is really important. I'm always as honest as possible. Again, it depends. If I'm making there's films that we make where we're trying to sometimes an expose on something that was criminal, for example. So in those, are you? But I am always. I try to be, even in those cases, I try to be as transparent as possible.
Mm,
And set expectations and tell them I'm going to, and almost to the point of being brutally honest. Like this is what this film is going to be about. This is what we're doing. This is how I plan to, this is what I would like to, how why your story matters.
yeah.
And this is how the vision of it. And do you want to participate? And if you don't, that's okay. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Obviously, but it's that, I think it's that honesty, as being as honest as possible with the folks that you are working with, that is key. And explaining to what it is that you're doing, all the sides of it, what can happen, the good and the bad.
Hmm. Yeah.
I
Well,
think that is really helpful, because people, okay, first of all, can smell bullshit, like they can smell it. So and then two, just, I think they would rather know, they feel more empowered by, if they understand that you're going to be straight with them and
yeah.
tell them the truth.
Well, truth telling and straight shooting and transparency, all great qualities and characteristics for people to enjoy and appreciate and really hopefully get a lot of insights from. Geeta, thank you so much. This was really a treat to share some time with you, and I hope we can visit with you again down the line.
Absolutely. Thanks for the time. Thanks for the interest.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.